In military aviation archaeology, certain geographic sectors function as practical barriers against physical recovery operations. When a transport aircraft goes down in extreme roadless terrain along a remote frontier, the geography itself can dictate the limit of what investigators can safely attempt. Contemporary wartime reports sometimes described specific crash areas as unrecoverable with the resources and access available at the time. This was not simply a matter of opinion or inconvenience, it was a risk-based decision. The environment could impose a hard operational boundary, where attempts to push deeper would carry an unacceptable probability of losing additional personnel to the same terrain and weather. The target of this specific non-disturbance investigation is a United States Army Air Force's Curtiss C-46A Commando, believed to correspond to the missing airframe recorded as serial number 4261072. The primary operational objective is to confirm that identity through strictly non-intrusive surface documentation, using visible structural features and any exposed component serials that can be read without moving debris, and to lock the exact geographic coordinates of the site. On January 6, 1945, wartime loss documentation describes this heavy transport aircraft departing from the airfield at Sookerating, India, bound for the base at Chanyi, China. This route ran through the hazardous aerial corridor widely known as the Hump. The inherent logistics of this sustained airlift demanded that heavy cargo aircraft cross extreme topographic barriers, often relying on minimal navigational infrastructure and facing severe atmospheric volatility. The crew on this flight consisted of 3 personnel: First Lieutenant Ray C. Taylor serving as the pilot, Second Lieutenant Harvey Boss, and Private Robert L. Crowder. Following the initial departure from Sookerating, the flight failed to arrive at the Chanyi destination at the scheduled time. The sudden operational absence of the aircraft immediately triggered a procedural assessment of the intended flight path. Because the C-46A Commando vanished over a region characterized by severe and unrelenting topographic isolation, immediate overland search efforts were determined to be mathematically unfeasible. The absolute lack of established mechanized access routes meant that any ground-based expedition would have to proceed entirely on foot. Such an effort would require navigating through dense jungle vegetation, crossing unbridged rivers, and scaling steep mountain inclines for weeks. In 1945, rotary wing aviation existed only in a very limited early form, with severe payload and performance constraints. Even where helicopters had proven that rescue was sometimes possible, they could not reliably insert and sustain teams in steep, forested, roadless terrain under bad weather. This lack of physical access suspended the evidence chain. Serial number 4261072 remained an administrative loss without a verified debris field, and the 3 men on board were officially carried as missing in action. Even so, a long-lived crash site cannot be treated as perfectly sealed. Limited disturbance or opportunistic removal of exposed metal remains possible over time. To resolve the case within the same terrain limits that stopped investigators in 1945, the approach has to be built around access, not extraction. Reaching the suspected lost zone still requires bypassing all conventional mechanized transport and operating at the edge of human endurance in steep, roadless border hills. Once on site, the mandate is non-disturbance, no moving earth, no clearing deep roots, and no dismantling coherent structure. Only surface documentation of what is already exposed. The environment that blocked wartime recovery now functions as the practical enforcement mechanism for preservation. This strict operational framework establishes a hard limit on what the investigators can definitively prove. The survey team must rely entirely on the visible exterior evidence of the C-46A Commando to verify its serial number and configuration. The entire challenge is physical, governed by the inflexible laws of navigation and human endurance in highly austere environments. Before any site documentation can commence, the investigation must analyze the exact sequence of operational events that placed the aircraft into this unrecoverable zone. The primary question remains, what specific flight trajectory locked this heavy transport aircraft into remote border hills on that particular day? At 14:34 Greenwich Mean Time, the departure record later preserved an unforgiving operational trade-off for the flight crew. As the C-46A Commando departed the runway, the pilots faced a standard but restrictive decision matrix. Operating under the 1337th Army Air Force's base unit of the Air Transport Command, the crew had to transition quickly into instrument procedures in deteriorating weather and limited visibility. To reach their assigned cruising altitude, they began a sustained climb toward rising terrain along the frontier hills. This departure profile forced the crew to rely heavily on procedural timing and geographic checkpoints. Later summaries associated with Missing Aircrew Report 11099 describe a final routine radio contact reported near the town of Sadiya in India. That report is treated as the last confirmed checkpoint in the administrative record, even as the exact location of the loss remained unknown at the time. Establishing this last known data point is the critical first step in defining the loss mechanics. The transmission over Sadiya meant the crew had committed to the instrument departure terrain hazard. Navigating the blind climb boundary required the pilots to manage aircraft performance against a rapidly rising topographic profile without any visual reference or ground-based radar support. Climbing out of the deep Assamese valleys into the primary Himalayan range under instrument conditions demands strict adherence to calculated climb gradients. The aircraft must continuously generate enough lift to outpace the upward slope of the mountain ridges ahead, relying strictly on barometric altimeters and magnetic compasses. If an unforeseen atmospheric downdraft or a sudden engine performance deficit degrades the required rate of climb, the flight path angle drops below the terrain gradient. The inevitable geometric result is an intersection with the mountain face long before the aircraft can clear the summit. This mechanical reality locked the flight into a geographical trap. When the climb rate failed to clear the rising rock wall, the aircraft intersected the mountain face deep inside an isolated jungle zone, far beyond any valley road network. Instead of coming down on terrain that vehicles could reach, the airframe drove into a steep, high-elevation slope cut by timber and ravines, scattering a debris field across a remote footprint that no heavy equipment of the era could access. Because no distress call followed the Sadiya checkpoint, investigators had no telemetry to define the moment of failure. Missing Aircrew Report 11099 preserved only a departure time, a unit designation, and a single confirmed radio contact, leaving a wide geographic gap between the last transmission and the intended destination in China. With no continuous radar coverage or transponder tracking, any plausible track had to be inferred from the administrative record and reconstructed from archival documentation. Missing Aircrew Report 11099 supplied the only firm anchor, the verified radio call near Sadiya. To define the target polygon, the expedition rejected a generalized grid search across massive mountain ranges as logistically impossible and committed instead to a mathematical projection of the intended flight path. By plotting the verified radio call over Sadiya, they established a geographic anchor point. Drawing a direct line from Sadiya toward the destination of Chanyi provides a baseline track, but factoring in the airspeed of the aircraft and potential wind drift establishes a diverging cone of probability. This process of search polygon narrowing successfully eliminates hundreds of square miles of surrounding terrain, focusing all logistical effort on one specific ridgeline intersection. In the early 21st century, a private investigation team mounted an overland expedition to reach the mathematically defined zone. The insertion required a multi-day trek through steep valleys and dense jungle, with repeated river crossings made entirely on foot. The success of this insertion depended entirely on local knowledge. The investigators could use satellite mapping and handheld receivers to lock coordinates, but they could not rely on that technology alone to find passable trails through dense undergrowth. In this environment, the route was still solved on foot, with local knowledge identifying viable paths up the slope. Under strict non-disturbance protocols, the expedition finally intersected the mathematical search polygon and established visual contact with an artificial footprint on October 28, 2025. The target zone was defined by heavily oxidized aluminum structures protruding through decades of dense organic accumulation. Achieving visual confirmation of the wreckage directly satisfied the primary baseline objective of the survey operation. Decades of geographic isolation were broken by the direct observation of coherent aircraft components resting where the search projection converged. To establish positive identification under these severe terrain limits, The team utilized surface dispersal mapping and non-intrusive visual documentation. By analyzing the footprint of scattered components without physically moving them, investigators can trace a distinct structural signature in wing spars, engine nacelle remnants, and heavy-gauge transport framing. Where component serials are exposed and readable without shifting debris, those identifiers can provide a harder lock than shape alone. Matching the visible configuration cues against factory schematics together with any readable component serial data supports aircraft type identification without excavation or violation of the non-disturbance mandate. This visual evidence required careful differentiation. The India to China supply route was highly trafficked by various twin-engine transport types. By improving the specific identity meant distinguishing the wreckage from a standard military transport or other common cargo airframes. The structural dimensions documented on the mountain slope, specifically the heavier payload framing and the distinct aerodynamic shape of the surviving flight surfaces, confirm the heavier transport classification. The coherent debris definitively belonged to a Curtiss C-46A Commando. Correlating the verified structural type with the coordinates in the archival loss record narrowed the remaining ambiguities. Where an exposed component serial can be read without disturbing the site, that identifier can be cross-referenced against maintenance and loss documentation to support a specific airframe assignment. In this case, the combination of location, configuration, and serial-based correlation supports the conclusion that the wreckage corresponds to the aircraft recorded as serial number 4261072. The confirmation tethered a missing aircrew report to a verified geographic coordinate. Even with the site located, dense jungle growth had fused much of the aluminum structure into the mountainside over decades. Large sections of the fuselage and flight deck were entombed beneath root systems, soil layers, and fallen timber, leaving only exposed surfaces available for documentation. The survey team operated under a rigid mandate to document but not alter the environment. They generated high-resolution photographic records of the exposed metal and locked the global positioning system coordinates for official government reference. And no mechanical tools were deployed to unearth the heavier elements of the main body, and no attempt was made to shift sections of the fuselage to read obscured interior data plates. The investigator simply mapped the visible extent of the debris field across the steep slope, carefully defining the exact perimeter of the surface scatter. The coherent visual evidence successfully proved the identity of the missing airframe and completely closed the historical geographic gap. Yet the physical reality of the site meant that the documentation ended exactly where the soil began. The operational success of mapping the exterior components immediately defined a new limit, raising the critical question of what the surface footprint conceals beneath the deep jungle floor. The successful generation of a fixed coordinate boundary creates an immediate forensic contradiction. While the geographic location of the aircraft is completely resolved, the physical extraction of the 3 missing crew members remains explicitly blocked. The survey team operates under a strict legal firewall regarding the actual contents of the debris field. The Defense POW and MIA Accounting Agency is the United States Department of Defense organization responsible for accounting for missing United States personnel. In practice, any excavation or recovery effort must be coordinated through authorized government channels and conducted in accordance with host nation laws and agreements. For a private team, the safest and most defensible standard is strict non-disturbance. Document what is visible, lock the coordinates, and report the site through official processes rather than attempting to search beneath the surface. Crossing that boundary risks contaminating evidence and undermining the chain of custody required for official forensic work. Therefore, no remains were removed, touched, or physically disturbed during the entire overland expedition. The protocol for this type of civilian survey requires extreme evidence discipline. When a private team encounters a debris field containing possible military remains, the required action is immediate withdrawal from the subsurface matrix. The team must transition entirely to a site containment mindset. They focus strictly on locking the fixed geographic coordinates and photographing the surrounding terrain features. This disciplined approach ensures that when a fully equipped government recovery team eventually deploys to the designated coordinates, they inherit a completely pristine site. The site formation processes, including exactly how the detached evidence settled and how the mountain soil layered over the heavier transport components, must be preserved exactly as they developed since the original impact. The documentation of the site ends exactly at this legal and physical barrier. The civilian expedition successfully delivered the required positional data, but the site itself remains frozen in a state of suspended forensic potential. Protected by severe Himalayan terrain and strict legal mandates, the airframe waits for the next phase of official action. The operational state transitions from a civilian search outcome to a government jurisdiction, leaving one definitive question regarding how long the site will wait for an official military recovery. After the site visit on October 28, 2025, a new administrative phase began in the life cycle of the documented debris field. The civilian expedition had achieved its primary objective by yielding actionable coordinates under non-disturbance constraints. The team transitioned from field movement into data processing, compiling the coordinate data and the surface photography gathered under severe physical limits. That information was formatted into reporting structures intended to interface with official accounting channels, shifting responsibility from the private survey team to authorized government agencies. The stewardship of the site relies on a combination of administrative oversight and sheer physical inaccessibility. The remote frontier hills deter casual access and reduce large-scale interference, but they do not guarantee perfect isolation. With no continuous physical monitoring on the slope, protection comes from distance, terrain, and the decision to keep the site unexcavated until an official, authorized recovery effort is scheduled. While the initial physical search problem is completely resolved, the operational reality of the site remains highly constrained. The same extreme topographical isolation that defeated the military recovery teams in 1945 continues to dictate the parameters for any modern intervention. Launching an official extraction operation will require deploying specialized government forensic teams capable of sustaining heavy excavation operations in an austere, high-altitude jungle environment. This requires massive logistical support, official sovereign clearances, and specialized equipment that private teams cannot legally possess or physically transport. The airframe rests exactly where it fell, managed through administrative tracking rather than continuous physical presence. The civilian survey successfully bridged the geographic gap, transforming an unknown loss into a fixed point on a map. The evidence is secured and the chain of custody is established without a single piece of earth being moved. The operational record for the private expedition concludes entirely with the verified data transfer, leaving one final procedural question regarding when the military apparatus will allocate the necessary logistical assets to execute a full forensic recovery under severe terrain constraints.